The missing muffin. Detective Max Malone was not your typical detective. He had a knack for solving cases, but his methods were often unconventional, to say the least. His office was a cluttered mess of old case files, half-eaten sandwiches, and a peculiar collection of rubber ducks. Despite the chaos, Max had a reputation for getting the job done, even if it meant stumbling into the solution by accident. One sunny afternoon, as Max was contemplating the mysteries of life over a cup of lukewarm coffee, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Hargrove, the owner of the local bakery, Sweet Delights. "Detective Malone, you must come quickly." Mrs. Hargrove's voice was frantic. "Someone has stolen my prized blueberry muffin." Max raised an eyebrow. "A muffin, you say?" "Yes, but not just any muffin. It's the one I was going to enter in the county fair," Mrs. Hargrove exclaimed. Max sighed, but he couldn't resist a good mystery, no matter how small. "All right, Mrs. Hargrove, I'll be there in a jiffy." Arriving at the bakery, Max was greeted by the sweet aroma of freshly baked goods. Mrs. Hargrove, a petite woman with flour-dusted hair, was pacing nervously behind the counter. "Thank you for coming, Detective," she said, wringing her hands. "I don't know who would do such a thing." Max nodded, taking out his notepad. "Let's start with the basics. When did you last see the muffin?" "This morning, just before opening. I placed it on the display stand, and when I turned around, it was gone," Mrs. Hargrove explained. Max scribbled down notes, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Did you notice anyone suspicious?" Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. "No, but I did hear a strange noise coming from the back room." Max's eyes lit up. "A clue. Let's investigate." They made their way to the back room, where Max immediately tripped over a mop bucket, sending water splashing everywhere. "Oops," he muttered, trying to regain his composure. Mrs. Hargrove stifled a giggle. "Careful, Detective." Max examined the room, his eyes landing on a small window slightly ajar. "Aha! Our thief might have entered through here." Just then, a loud crash echoed from the front of the bakery. Max and Mrs. Hargrove rushed back to find a young man, covered in flour, standing amidst a pile of overturned baking trays. "Who are you?" Max demanded, pointing his notepad like a weapon. The young man raised his hands in surrender. "I'm Tim, the delivery guy. I swear I didn't take the muffin." Max narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you covered in flour?" Tim looked sheepish. "I tripped over the mop bucket." Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "That bucket is a menace." Max scratched his head, feeling the case slipping through his fingers. "All right, Tim, if you didn't take the muffin, do you know who might have?" Tim hesitated. "Well, I did see Mr. Jenkins, the butcher, hanging around earlier. He seemed awfully interested in the bakery today." Max's eyes widened. The plot thickens. To the butcher shop. With Mrs. Hargrove in tow, Max marched across the street to Jenkins' butcher shop. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and Mr. Jenkins, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, looked up from behind the counter. "Ah, Detective Malone. What brings you here? Jenkins asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Max got straight to the point. Mr. Jenkins, did you happen to see a blueberry muffin around here? Jenkins chuckled. A muffin? No, but I did see a rather plump squirrel running off with something blue this morning. Mrs. Hargrove gasped. A squirrel, of course, they love my muffins. Max slapped his forehead. A classic case of mistaken identity. Feeling both relieved and slightly embarrassed, Max and Mrs. Hargrove returned to the bakery. As they entered, they spotted the mischievous squirrel sitting on the windowsill, nibbling on the missing muffin. Max chuckled, shaking his head. Well, Mrs. Hargrove, it seems your thief has been caught red-handed, or rather, blue-pawed. Mrs. Hargrove laughed, her tension finally easing. Thank you, Detective Malone. I suppose I owe you a muffin. Max grinned, tipping his hat. Just doing my job, ma'am. And maybe next time, keep an eye on those squirrels. As Max left the bakery, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the most glamorous case, but it was certainly one of the most entertaining. And in the world of Detective Max Malone, that was all that mattered. Later that day, as Max returned to his office, he found a small package waiting for him on his desk. It was from Mrs. Hargrove, containing a fresh batch of muffins as a token of gratitude. Max chuckled, placing the muffins next to his rubber duck collection. A sweet ending to a sweet case, he mused. As he settled back into his chair, Max's phone rang again. Detective Malone, he answered, ready for the next adventure. Detective, it's Officer Jenkins from the precinct. We've got a situation at the park. Someone's been stealing picnic baskets, the voice on the other end exclaimed. Max grinned, grabbing his coat. On my way, officer. Sounds like another case for Detective Max Malone. With a spring in his step, Max headed out the door, ready to tackle whatever mystery awaited him next. After all, in the quirky world of Detective Max Malone, every day was an opportunity for a new and amusing adventure.